Have you ever felt that sometimes the only true answer is to walk away? What if the greatest act of courage isn't facing the chaos of the world, but choosing silence? What happens when society's noise becomes so deafening that the only way out is to step away? If these times persist, I shall become a hermit, for I see nothing here but pain and torment. These words from Eustache Deschamps echo like a whisper from centuries past, yet they could have been spoken just yesterday. When the world seems consumed by corruption, inequality, and relentless noise, an uncomfortable question arises. What if true freedom isn't in resisting but in letting go? Imagine a man slowly walking away from the gates of an ancient city. Each step isn't driven by cowardice but by a deep longing for peace. This solitary figure could be Lao Tzu, the Chinese sage who, according to legend, left and never returned after writing the Tao Te Ching. Some say he sought a simple life, others believe he was weary of society's moral decay. But regardless of the reason, he did something few dare to do. He turned his back on the world. How many times amid overwhelming news, daily demands, and the endless race for success and recognition, have you thought, I just wish I could disappear for a while? This feeling is nothing new. Throughout history and across cultures, there have always been those who heard this silent calling, the desire to withdraw, to find refuge in solitude, to seek peace away from the noise of the world. They are the hermits, souls who, instead of fighting against the current, chose to step out of the river and watch the flow from the shore. But what makes someone abandon everything? What is it about solitude that can be so valuable? And in such a hyper-connected world, is it still possible to be a hermit today? In this video, we'll explore the reasons why isolation can be a legitimate response, perhaps even the only response, in an increasingly noisy world. Get ready to dive into the stories of sages, thinkers, and solitary souls who found in solitude a kind of freedom that few have ever dared to imagine. Now let me ask you, is leaving an act of giving up, or perhaps the greatest proof of wisdom? There comes a moment when the noise of the world becomes deafening. Voices blend into a sea of shallow opinions. Time is consumed by meaningless tasks, and the soul grows weary. And then a deep restlessness arises. Is it still worth staying? We live in a society that constantly pressures us to stay, to endure, to fight. From a young age, we are taught that giving up is synonymous with weakness. But what if, at certain moments, leaving is the most powerful act of all? What if walking away is not abandonment, but liberation? History is full of examples of people who understood this truth. Think of Lao Tzu, who before vanishing from society, left behind the Tao Te Ching, a timeless legacy of wisdom. He didn't run away. He freed himself from a world where greed and power spoke louder than simplicity and harmony. But this decision isn't exclusive to mythical figures or ancient sages. Throughout history, across different cultures, the desire to step away from social chaos has repeated itself. In ancient India, the forest ascetics, described in the Upanishads, retreated far from worldly distractions in search of a deeper understanding of existence. It wasn't escape, it was a quest. Behind this urge to leave, there is an invisible thread connecting all those who have grown weary of the world. The exhaustion of the soul in the face of corruption, falsehood, and social futility. When everything around seems to be falling apart, when injustice becomes the norm, and the emptiness of daily interactions crushes any remaining trace of authenticity, withdrawal ceases to be a weakness. It becomes a vital necessity. The philosophy of the Desert Fathers at the dawn of Christianity follows this same path. They abandoned everything and set out towards silence, seeking a space where they could finally hear their own conscience. They fled from the corruption that, little by little, was contaminating the faith and the values they believed to be pure. But in the end, their escape was not from the outside world, but from an inner world overwhelmed by excess. And today, is there still room for such a radical choice? We live in an era of instant connections where silence feels like an unattainable luxury. Every notification, every update, every piece of news pulls us back into the noise, and amid all this, the temptation arises to simply leave, disconnect, step away, to find, in solitude, a refuge from the constant bombardment of information and expectations. Leaving may seem like an extreme response, but perhaps it is precisely the extreme we need to rediscover peace. After all, what is more courageous? Staying in a place where everything hurts, or seeking beyond this chaos, a space where the soul can finally breathe? But what if the real challenge is not in physically leaving, but in learning to withdraw from within? Is it possible to live in the midst of the world yet be at peace with one's own silence? The desire to withdraw from the world is nothing new. It echoes through the centuries, silent yet constant, like a whisper from the depths of the human soul. Since the dawn of civilization, there have always been those who, weary of the chaos and futility of daily life, chose to turn their backs on society and seek refuge in solitude. Who were these people? What led them to choose silence over noise? The history of hermits is as old as humanity itself, a journey of renunciation, introspection, and paradoxically, a quest for a deeper connection, not with others, but with oneself and the universe. In ancient India, long before Western philosophy took shape, Vedic ascetics had already retreated to the forests in search of spiritual enlightenment. The Upanishads tell of sages who abandoned their material lives to live in isolation, meditating on the fundamental questions of existence. They were not escaping. On the contrary, they were diving into the purest essence of reality, far from the distractions of the mundane world. Centuries later, in arid and silent lands, the first Christian hermits emerged, known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. Among them, figures like Saint Anthony of the Desert and Amma Syncletica of Alexandria gave up everything in pursuit of the true essence of faith, far from religious institutions that, in their view, had become increasingly corrupted by power. They understood that true spirituality was not found in lavish temples, but in the silence of the heart and the vastness of the desert. And what about Lao Tzu, the Chinese sage who, according to legend, left the imperial court behind and withdrew to a life of simplicity and connection with nature? Before departing, he wrote the Tao Te Ching, one of the most profound texts in Eastern philosophy, teaching that true wisdom lies in flowing with nature, in accepting what is, without resistance. This search for solitude also resonated with brilliant minds in Western philosophy. Henry David Thoreau, for example, withdrew to the shores of Walden Pond in the United States, where he lived for 2 years in the midst of nature. From there, he wrote Walden, Life in the Woods, a reflection on simplicity, self-sufficiency, and the value of isolation. To Thoreau, life among the crowd distances us from ourselves, while solitude reconnects us with what is essential. Another example is the monk and writer Thomas Merton, who, in his spiritual retreat, found a clarity of thought and a depth of soul that he could never have reached amid the noise of the world. He believed that solitude was not a state of emptiness, but a fertile space where the spirit could flourish. The most striking realization is that despite their cultural, geographical, and temporal differences, all these hermits share the same essence: the search for something the outside world cannot offer. A space of peace, a deep connection with the self, a refuge away from the chaos and illusions of society. And the most intriguing part? Even in isolation, many of these hermits became sources of wisdom for the very world they had left behind. Paradoxically, while fleeing from society, they ended up becoming beacons for those who remained in it, offering guidance, inspiration, and valuable teachings. The call of solitude, then, is not merely an act of escape. It is a journey of rediscovery, a return to one's essence, and perhaps a reminder that sometimes we need to step away in order to truly see what makes a person simply leave, drop everything, the routine, the ties, the comfort of the familiar. What is so deep and non-negotiable within someone that it drives them to seek the absolute silence of solitude? This question has spanned centuries and cultures, and the answers are never simple. They are as varied as the souls who have chosen to withdraw. But at its core, there is a common denominator: the exhaustion of the soul in the face of a world that often seems to have lost its meaning. For many, the primary reason is the spiritual quest. Throughout history, countless hermits have distanced themselves from society, not out of hatred for the world, but out of love for the sacred. They felt that the noise of everyday life drowned out the inner voice, muffled the divine call, and so they chose to retreat in search of a pure, deeper connection. Taoist hermits, for example, isolated themselves in the mountains to attune to the Tao, the natural flow of the universe. To them, true wisdom was not about mastering the world, but harmonizing with it, something that could only be achieved far from the distractions of mundane life. But not everyone leaves driven by a spiritual calling. Sometimes the motivation comes from something darker: disillusionment with humanity. When power structures become corrupt, when justice seems blind, and human interactions grow shallow, some souls simply give up on trying to fix a broken system. This was the case with the Desert Fathers. They sought not only God, but also rejected what they saw as the decline of faith and morality, corrupted by the alliances between the Church and the Roman Empire. Their withdrawal was both an act of faith and a silent protest against a society that no longer reflected their values. And what about our modern times? Disillusionment exists here too. perhaps more than ever. We live in an era of hyperconnectivity where we are constantly bombarded with information, comparisons, and unattainable expectations. Social media, pressure for productivity, economic crises, political polarization, all of this fuels a silent fatigue, an exhaustion that corrodes from the inside out. How many times have you felt like everything around you is moving too fast, that there's no time to breathe, to reflect, to simply be? It's in this overwhelming rush that the desire to disappear arises, the urge to drop everything and leave in search of a place where the mind can finally find peace. But leaving is also an act of relinquishing control. Many who isolate themselves come to realize an uncomfortable truth. They cannot change the world, they cannot control corruption, greed, or global tragedies. But they can control something far more powerful, their own presence. They can choose where and how to exist. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, though not a hermit in the classical sense, deeply understood the value of solitude. He believed that crowds were the enemy of true thought and that isolation allowed for an intellectual and emotional freedom unattainable amid the noise of society. And then there's a third reason, one that resonates deeply with the most sensitive souls: the pursuit of authenticity. In a world that constantly demands we be something we are not, isolation can be an act of self-preservation, a space where no one imposes expectations, where one can, at last, live without masks. The writer Christopher Knight, known as the North Pond Hermit of Maine, spent 27 years isolated in the woods, living in absolute silence. His story, told in the book The Stranger in the Woods, reveals a man who didn't flee society out of hatred, but out of an uncontrollable desire for peace and authenticity. Far from civilization, he found what many spend a lifetime searching for: a sense of belonging, not to the outside world, but to himself. In the end, every hermit carries their own reasons, their wounds and their hopes, but they all share the same silent truth. Sometimes leaving is not an escape. It's a return to essence, a reunion with what, amid the noise and chaos of modern life, we so often forget: who we truly are when the world stops watching us. We live in the era of hyperconnection. We are surrounded by networks, devices, constant notifications, and an endless flood of information. We have never been more connected, and paradoxically, we have never been more alone. In the midst of this whirlwind, a curious and, in a way, revolutionary figure emerges: the urban hermit. But what exactly is a hermit in the chaos of the city? How can someone seek solitude in a place where the noise never stops and the crowd feels inescapable? Here lies the true paradox. In a world where everything and everyone is just a click away, the boldest act might be to disconnect, not physically, but internally, to carve out a space of isolation within daily life, like a monk in the heart of the metropolis. There is an old Chinese proverb that says, "The mediocre hermit retreats to the mountains. The great hermit lives in the city." This idea carries profound weight. The ability to find peace amid chaos may be the greatest virtue of all. It is easy to escape noise when everything around you is silent, but maintaining serenity in the midst of a crowd requires an almost superhuman level of discipline and inner strength. Today, physical isolation is no longer the only path. Thanks to technology, we can paradoxically live in isolation even in the heart of a major city. Working remotely, ordering food through apps, shopping online, handling banking without leaving home. In theory, someone could go days or even months without having a face-to-face interaction with another person. But this raises an unsettling question. Does this modern solitude truly bring peace, or is it just a new kind of forced isolation filled with emptiness? The concept of the urban hermit goes beyond simply withdrawing from people. It's about creating an inner space of tranquility amid external chaos, a silent refuge in the mind, even as traffic roars outside or the phone buzzes with endless notifications. Think of an artist who, in a small apartment, creates an entire universe among canvases, brushes, and books, or a writer who turns the solitude of a room into an infinite ocean of ideas. In this context, isolation is not abandonment. It is creation, but not everyone can turn solitude into something productive. For many, living in isolation in a city can be a reflection of a world that has become impersonal and indifferent. The phenomenon of hikikomori in Japan, for example, reveals a darker side of this reality. Young people and adults who completely withdraw from society, often driven by unbearable social pressures, personal failures, or overwhelming anxiety. Still, there is a difference between forced isolation and chosen solitude. A true urban hermit does not retreat out of desperation. He withdraws by choice, seeking balance, inner peace, and freedom from excessive stimuli. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche argued that solitude was essential for personal growth. To him, moments of isolation allowed individuals to transcend social expectations and develop true independence of thought. He believed that free from the influence of the masses, a person could come closer to their highest potential, the concept of the Übermensch, one who surpasses the limitations imposed by society. Today, perhaps the greatest challenge is not physical isolation, but emotional and mental detachment. In a world that demands constant engagement, maybe true freedom lies in disconnecting, not just from social networks, but also from external expectations. And in a way, being a modern hermit doesn't mean hiding in a forest, but finding your own inner mountain, even if it's in the middle of concrete, amid the noise of the city and the glow of neon lights. A true urban hermit learns to be alone even when surrounded by people. And in this paradox, they find the peace that so many seek far away, without realizing that sometimes the real refuge isn't out there, but within. We have finally arrived at the inevitable question: is it time to leave? When the world becomes too heavy, when expectations suffocate and responsibilities turn into invisible chains, a thought arises, subtle at first, then increasingly clear. What if I simply walked away? But leaving, in the true philosophical sense, doesn't necessarily mean abandoning everything physically. Sometimes the most radical act of freedom isn't escaping to a distant forest, but detaching internally. The real escape happens in the mind and heart when you decide to let go of what you can no longer carry. Detachment is a central idea in many philosophical and spiritual traditions. In Buddhism, for example, it is considered the path to the end of suffering. Buddha himself taught that suffering is born from attachment to impermanent things, status, possessions, recognition, even people. True freedom emerges when you learn to let go, but detachment doesn't mean rejecting the world. It means not being enslaved by it. It is understanding that everything external, wealth, power, the opinions of others, is transient. And, as the Indian sage Ramana Maharshi once said, detachment does not mean you should own nothing. It means that nothing should own you. In a world where we are constantly taught to seek more money, more success, more connections, the true act of rebellion may be to desire less. And this is where the philosophy of the hermit becomes more relevant than ever. Leaving, then, can be understood as an act of liberation from the invisible chains imposed by society. It's not just about escaping external noise, but about finding true inner peace. Remember the philosopher Schopenhauer, who believed that human suffering came from incessant desire, and that true happiness was not in achievement, but in the absence of desire. But this philosophy is not for the weak. Letting go requires a kind of courage that few are willing to cultivate. It is looking at the world and saying, I don't need this to be whole. And the question remains, is it possible to practice this freedom without abandoning everything? Yes, it is. Not everyone is meant to be a hermit in the classical sense. Not everyone desires to live in a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. But there are valuable lessons we can take from this way of life, even while living in the heart of society. First, inner silence. Finding moments of solitude amidst a hectic routine can be a powerful way to reconnect. Turning off your phone, staying away from social media for a while, or simply walking in silence can be a transformative exercise. Second, voluntary simplicity. Reducing excessive consumption, letting go of habits that drain your energy, and valuing the small joys of everyday life. All of this is a way to step away from excess without needing to physically leave. Finally, the most challenging of all, emotional detachment. It means learning not to depend on external validation, on others' opinions, or on imposed standards of success. It's understanding that deep down, your peace should be in no one's hands but your own. And perhaps this is exactly what hermits have always tried to teach us. True solitude is not about being far from the world, but about being free from it, even in the middle of a crowd. Now, I ask you, do you really need to leave, or can you find your own refuge within yourself? The answer, as in every true philosophical journey, is not in the words you've heard here. It's in the silence that remains afterward. Before we wrap up, I want to share something personal with you. There was a time in my life when the noise of the world felt unbearable. The pressure, the expectations, the constant feeling of having to live up to something or someone. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to disappear. Not physically, but from the inside out. I shut out the external voices, stopped seeking validation, and for the first time in a long while, I listened to my own silence. And in that silence, I found peace. So if you've made it this far, I want to thank you. Because in a way, Watching this video is already a small act of letting go. It's a moment when you chose to pause, breathe, and reflect on something bigger than the everyday noise, and who knows, maybe this is the beginning of a journey to reconnect with yourself. Now, before you set off in search of your own silent mountain, let me remind you of one essential detail. Don't leave without subscribing to the channel. After all, even hermits need company from time to time, even if it's in silence. Oh, and since we're talking about letting go, how about dropping a like? It won't cost you anything, and honestly, it might just be the final touch on your path to enlightenment, or at the very least, it'll help the algorithm find its inner peace. And if you enjoyed this philosophical journey, check out the videos popping up on your screen right now. One of them might have the exact answer you didn't even know you were looking for.